They were the spoiled sons of the richest landowner in the whole region. Twins, who were famous for tormenting those who could not defend themselves. On that suffocating afternoon in 1858, they picked the most fragile victim, an enslaved mother, exhausted, who could barely stand after working in the fields since before sunrise. They laughed at her, shoved her, knocked her down to the ground, humiliating her as if she were nothing. What they did not know was that she had a son, an enormous young man, deaf since birth, who understood the world through the vibrations in the earth and through his mother's eyes. 3 hours later, when the sun slowly started to sink, he saw his mother covered in blood and in shock, and at that moment, every limit ended. The 7'2" young man entered the mansion quietly, pushed by a silent rage no one had ever seen before. The wealthy twins never heard their own sentence. They only felt his presence behind the door, and then the terror truly began. Before we continue this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe and comment freedom, so I know who you are. Thank you. And now let's continue. The midday heat turned the Belmont estate into a giant open-air furnace. It was August 3rd, 1858, and the interior of Sao Paulo was suffering through one of the worst droughts of the decade. The cracked soil released dust with every step, and the air seemed to burn the lungs of anyone who breathed too deeply. Helena walked bent over between the coffee plants, carrying a basket of beans that weighed almost as much as she did. She was 38 years old, but she looked 20 years older. Her rough hands bled at the fingertips, and her curved back told the story of 2 long decades of breaking her body in the harvest fields. The Belmont estate had belonged to the Drummond family for 3 generations. Colonel Antonio Drummond was the patriarch, a 62-year-old man whose wealth came from 120 acres of land and more than 300 people kept in captivity. He rarely appeared in the fields. He preferred to supervise from a distance, leaving the harsh work to brutal overseers who controlled everything through fear. But it was his twin sons, Bernardo and Baltazar, who represented the worst form of meaningless cruelty. At 24 years old, the two had never worked a single day in their lives. They had been raised to inherit everything, to command without question, and to exercise absolute power over lives they considered less valuable than livestock. Bernardo was the louder of the two, tall, with dark hair carefully combed with imported brilliantine, always wearing expensive clothes that sharply contrasted with the misery around him. He carried a small whip at his waist, not because he needed it, but because he enjoyed the way people looked at him when they noticed it. Baltazar was quieter, but no less cruel. He looked exactly like his brother. They were physically identical, but while Bernardo was theatrical in his violence, Baltazar was cold and calculated. He watched people carefully, planned ahead, discovered their weaknesses, and used them with surgical precision. Together they formed a pair feared by everyone on the estate. They had a habit of choosing random targets for their cruel games. A man falsely accused of stealing and publicly whipped. A woman forced to work even while sick until she collapsed. Children separated from their mothers on a whim, just to see the desperation in the eyes of those who loved them. That afternoon they were bored. They had spent the morning drinking French wine on the veranda of the main house, playing cards, and complaining about the unbearable heat. Their father was away on business in Santos, and their mother, Donna Amelia, spent the day locked inside her chambers with her maids, ignoring everything that happened beyond her silk curtains. It was Bernardo who noticed Helena first. She had stumbled on the uneven ground, spilling half the beans from her basket. She was on her knees, picking them up one by one with shaking hands, knowing she would be punished for the loss. "Look at that, Baltazar," said Bernardo, pointing with his wineglass. Helena messed up again. Baltazar stood up slowly from his chair, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Let's go take a closer look." The two walked down from the veranda with the calm confidence of those who knew no one would dare question them. Their footsteps lifted clouds of dust as they approached Helena, who remained on her knees, pretending not to notice them. But she knew. Of course she knew. Everyone on the estate developed a sixth sense for detecting danger, and the Drummond twins were danger in human form. Helena, called Bernardo, stopping a few steps away from her. How many times have you been told to be careful with the harvest? She did not answer. She only continued collecting the beans with her head lowered. Responding could be seen as insolence. Not responding could also be seen as insolence. There was no safe choice. She's ignoring you, brother, said Balthazar, slowly walking around Helena, like a hunter circling prey. I think she went deaf. Must run in the family. The reference to Helena's son was deliberate and cruel. Balthazar knew exactly what he was doing. Bernardo stepped closer and kicked the basket, scattering the remaining beans across the ground. Now you'll have to pick everything again. It might take hours, maybe even all night. Helena tightened her fists, but kept her head down. She had learned over many years of suffering that showing anger only made things worse. She had learned to swallow humiliation, to turn pain into something small and heavy inside her chest, something she could carry without letting anyone see it. But Bernardo and Balthazar were not satisfied with only throwing the beans onto the ground. Stand up, ordered Bernardo. Helena obeyed slowly, her legs protesting after hours of labor without rest. She was a little over 5 feet 3 inches tall and painfully thin, with bones visible beneath her dark skin. Standing beside the well-fed and healthy twins, she looked even more fragile. You have a son, don't you? Asked Balthazar casually, as if he were making polite conversation. Helena's heart began to race, but her face remained calm and still. Yes, sir. What's his name again? Balthazar looked at his brother with fake confusion. That big one, the deaf one. Daniel, Helena answered, her voice quieter than she intended. Ah, yes, Daniel, Bernardo said with a smile. Poor thing. Can't even hear when someone talks to him. Must be difficult having a son like that. Defective. The word dropped between them like a stone falling into still water. Helena felt something break inside her, but she forced herself to remain silent. Daniel was not defective. He was different, yes, but he was strong, intelligent, capable of things these two spoiled men would never understand. Daniel was 22 years old and stood 7 feet 2 inches tall. He had been born deaf, the result of a fever Helena suffered during pregnancy. The first years were very difficult. She did not know how to communicate with him, or how to teach him about a world he could not hear. But Daniel learned in other ways. He learned to read people's lips, to understand facial expressions, to feel vibrations in the ground that told him when someone was approaching. He developed an incredible sense of awareness, always knowing who was nearby even without seeing them, and he was strong, unbelievably strong. Since childhood, he could lift heavy logs that grown men struggled to move. He worked in the estate sawmill, cutting and stacking wood, his strength constantly exploited, while his condition was used as an excuse to justify even worse treatment in a system where no one received real wages. But more than anything, Daniel was kind. He had a huge heart. He helped the weak, carried loads for the sick, and shared his food whenever someone was hungry. Helena knew her son had inherited from her a kindness the world constantly tried to destroy, and now these two monsters were using his name like a weapon. You know what I think, said Bernardo, stepping closer to Helena. I think you should work harder. A woman with a son like that should work double to make up for his defect. Don't you agree? Helena stayed silent, but her eyes began to shine with tears that refused to fall. Not from sadness, but from powerless rage. She's not agreeing, Balthazar observed. Maybe she needs a lesson. That was when Bernardo pushed Helena. It was not a strong push, just a careless shove on her shoulder. But she was exhausted and off balance. She fell backward onto the dry earth, raising a cloud of dust. Pain exploded through her spine, and she struggled not to scream. The twins laughed. Look at that. She fell again, Balthazar said mockingly. How clumsy. Helena tried to stand, but Bernardo placed his boot on her chest, pressing her back to the ground. It was not extreme force, only enough to humiliate her, to demonstrate power, to remind her that she had no rights and no dignity, that she was nothing more than property. Stay there, ordered Bernardo. until we decide if you are allowed to stand." Other enslaved people were working nearby, but no one looked. No one could dare to look. Interfering would bring the same violence, or something even worse. This was the cruel reality of the place. Everyone survived by lowering their heads and protecting themselves however they could, knowing that heroism usually meant death. Balthazar crouched beside Helena, examining her face as if she were an interesting insect. "You know we can do whatever we want with you, right? My father owns everything here. This land, this plantation, you and your defective son." "He's not defective." The words slipped out before Helena could stop them. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Bernardo removed his boot from Helena's chest, only to kick her sharply in the ribs. It was not strong enough to break bones, but it knocked the air from her lungs and filled her body with pain. "I didn't tell you to speak," Bernardo said quietly, his voice heavy with threat. Helena curled into herself, wrapping her arms around her ribs, trying desperately to breathe through the pain. Tears finally streamed down her face, drawing clean lines through the dust that covered her skin. "I don't think she has learned yet," Balthazar said while standing up. "We'll continue the lesson later, when we have more time." The two walked away, their laughter echoing through the coffee fields as they returned to the main house. They left Helena lying on the ground, surrounded by scattered coffee beans, every breath painful, every movement difficult. It took 15 minutes before she was able to sit up again. It took several minutes for Helena to finally manage to sit up. Every movement was pure agony, as if her body were being torn apart from the inside. She was certain she had at least one cracked rib, maybe even two. This kind of pain was not unfamiliar to her. Violence had always been part of life there. It was woven into every day like a dark thread. But this moment felt different. It was not only the strength of the physical pain. It was the way they had spoken about Daniel. They had used her son's name like bait, like a weapon meant to break her spirit. Helena understood the meaning behind it. They would not stop. The Drummond twins were known for this kind of cruelty. Whenever they discovered a weakness in someone, they kept pushing and pushing until the wound tore wide open. Helena knew she had to warn Daniel. She needed him to stay far away from the twins, to be cautious, to never give them any excuse to notice him. Moving slowly and painfully, Helena bent down and began gathering the scattered beans from the dirt. Each movement sent waves of pain through her ribs, but she kept working. Not working would bring even worse punishment. The sun burned mercilessly overhead, and sweat mixed with tears on her dusty face. What should normally take 30 minutes took her more than 2 hours to finish. When the task was finally done, she lifted the basket and carried it toward the storage shed. Every step felt like torture. Every breath reminded her of the brutal kick she had received earlier. Daniel was inside the sawmill, cutting heavy para-bar rower boards. The work demanded incredible strength. The large manual saw was heavy, and the dense wood resisted every stroke. Still, Daniel worked with steady rhythm, his powerful arms guiding the saw in long, controlled movements. He did not hear his mother approaching, of course, but he felt the vibration of her slow steps through the wooden floor of the shed. He turned his head, a smile beginning to appear on his face. The smile vanished the moment he saw her expression. Daniel dropped the saw instantly and hurried to Helena. His huge hands gently held his mother at Mead. His huge hands gently held his mother's face, wiping away the tears and dust that covered her cheeks. His dark eyes studied her with deep worry, searching carefully for injuries. Helena touched her son's face and forced herself to give a small, reassuring smile. Then, slowly, using the system of signs they had created through the years, a mixture of natural gestures and strong facial expressions, she began explaining what had happened. As Helena told the story, Daniel's hands slowly closed into tight fists. His tall body became stiff, muscles tightening under his worn shirt. His eyes darkened with a rage Helena rarely saw. Her son was naturally gentle, slow to anger, but when something touched his heart deeply, the fury inside him could be terrifying. Daniel lifted his gaze toward the main house, which stood on the hill beyond the trees. Helena saw the intention in his eyes even before he moved. She grabbed Daniel's arm quickly and shook her head with urgency. Her fingers pressed hard into his skin, trying to show him the danger, the terrible consequences that would follow if he acted on the anger growing inside him. Daniel looked at her, and Helena could see the painful battle inside his eyes. She saw the gentle boy she had raised, struggling against the man who felt he must defend his mother. Love clashed with helplessness. Rage crashed against the harsh reality of their lives. At last, Daniel slowly nodded. Yet Helena knew her son too well. She recognized that expression. He was not truly letting the matter go. He was simply delaying, thinking, planning. She gently pulled his head down until their foreheads touched, and they stayed like that for a long moment, mother and son together in suffering and in love, in a cruel world that treated them as less than human, yet could never take away the thing that made them human: the ability to care deeply for each other. When they finally separated, Helena turned, the one last gesture, silently asking him to be careful, to stay away from the twins, to survive. Daniel nodded once more, but even after Helena left, his eyes remained fixed on the distant main house for a long time. The next few hours passed with growing tension. Helena tried to continue working, but the pain in her ribs made every motion unbearable. The other workers noticed. They always noticed when someone was injured, because everyone knew that one day it could be them. An older woman named Rosa, who worked in the kitchen of the main house, quietly brought an herbal compress when the sun began to sink lower in the sky. Rosa was 60 years old, and there was very little left in the world that could still shock her. The master's boys did this, she asked softly, while helping Helena place the compress against her ribs. Helena only nodded silently. They are becoming worse, Rosa said with a tired shake of her head. Since the colonel started spending more time away from the estate, they do whatever they wish. No one controls them anymore. I'm afraid for Daniel, Helena whispered, her voice almost impossible to hear. Rosa looked at her with deep compassion and something else as well, a quiet understanding shared by all mothers who lived in that place. Daniel is strong, Rosa said slowly, but strength is nothing against. She stopped speaking before finishing the sentence. She did not need to continue. Both women already knew the truth. Strength meant nothing against the law, against guns, against a whole system built to crush any sign of resistance. Meanwhile, inside the large main house, the twins were enjoying a rich dinner. Plates filled with roasted meat, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and glasses of red wine covered the table. Donna Amelia sat quietly at the head of the table, pretending not to hear her son's cruel jokes about the events of the Dana. That Helena is too weak, Bernardo said while slicing a thick piece of meat. She fell with barely a push, hardly worth what father paid for her. But her son, Balthazar, smiled slowly. He could be interesting. Did you see how large that fellow is? He must be more than 7 feet tall and deaf, Bernardo added with a mocking grin. Being big is useless if you're defective. I was thinking, Balthazar said thoughtfully, while swirling the wine inside his glass. It might be amusing to test his limits. See how far a deaf giant can be pushed before he finally reacts. Bernardo laughed loudly. Are you suggesting an experiment? I'm suggesting entertainment, Balthazar corrected calmly. We are bored. Father travels for weeks at a time. Nothing interesting happens here. Why not see what happens if we push the one man everyone claims is as harmless as a lamb? He could break you in half, Bernardo replied, though his voice sounded excited rather than worried. Then we would have a reason to hang him, Balthazar answered with a cold smile. Either way, we would have our fun. That was how their minds worked. Human lives were nothing but games to them. Pain was entertainment. Absolute power had created absolute cruelty. They had never faced consequences for their actions. They had never truly felt fear. They had never been forced to see the people they abused as human beings instead of property. And that complete absence of empathy was about to lead them into a terrible mistake that would change everything. After dinner, As night slowly covered the estate, the twins sat on the wide veranda smoking cigars and making plans. The sky above was clear and filled with stars, and the air finally cooled after the harsh heat of the day. Tomorrow, Bernardo decided, blowing smoke into the night air, we will visit the sawmill. We should have a little conversation. Why? It's Daniel. You think he will understand? Balthazar asked with a smirk. Being deaf and all, he doesn't need to understand words to understand a whip. Bernardo replied while tapping ashes from his cigar, and his mother will understand it for him. Both brothers laughed loudly, a harsh sound that had become familiar across the estate. What they did not realize was that someone stood hidden in the darkness beyond the veranda. Daniel had come to check on his mother again, too worried to focus on work. He stood quietly among the shadows between the trees when he noticed the two young men sitting on the veranda of the main house. Of course he could not hear their voices, but he watched their lips from the distance, illuminated by the faint lantern light. He read every word, he understood every intention, and he saw, in their smiles, the same cruelty he had seen in many other white faces throughout his life. Something inside Daniel shifted at that moment, something his mother had always tried to protect, something gentle and hopeful that had survived despite everything. That fragile part of him finally cracked. Daniel was not like the man in Samuel's story. He did not have years of patience. He had not yet built a philosophy of quiet resistance. He was younger, more impulsive, and somewhere deep inside he understood that kindness in that world was often mistaken for weakness. He stood silently in the dark, watching the two men who were planning to torture him the following day. For the first time in his life, Daniel allowed himself to think about violence, not because he desired it, his nature resisted the thought completely, but because he understood that some monsters only responded to fear. If the Drummond twins wanted to make him their next amusement, then he had a decision to make. Would he remain their victim, or would he become something they never expected? The sun had completely disappeared when Daniel finally stepped away from the shadows and walked back toward the slave quarters where his mother waited. Helena immediately noticed something different in his eyes when he entered. A decision had been made. A line had been crossed inside him. She gently touched his face, her eyes asking a silent question. Daniel said nothing. He simply wrapped his arms around his mother, holding her carefully so he would not hurt her injured ribs. And in that quiet embrace, Helena felt something that filled her with both pride and deep fear. Her son was no longer the gentle boy she had raised. The world had forced that boy to become something else. The night moved slowly forward. Most people slept, exhausted from the endless labor. But Daniel remained awake, staring up at the thatched ceiling while thinking. He remembered every time someone had called him defective, useless, less than human because he could not hear. He remembered every moment he had watched his mother humiliated and hurt. He remembered the cruel system that allowed two spoiled young men to torture others for pleasure without punishment or justice. Then he remembered something an old man named Pedro had once told him using signs and gestures. The world will try to make you small. Never allow it. Your height is not only in your body, it is also in your spirit. And spirit cannot be broken unless you allow it. Daniel was not going to allow it. When the sun finally rose on August 4th, Daniel was awake, ready, and for the first time in his life, truly dangerous. The 4th day of August, 1858, arrived even hotter than the day before. The air felt heavy, filled with the promise of a storm that never came. People woke early as usual, preparing for another day of exhausting labor beneath the unforgiving sun. Helena could barely move, the pain in her ribs had grown worse during the night, and every breath felt like a sharp knife. Rosa came to help her stand, bringing more herbal compresses and a worried expression. "You should rest today," Rosa whispered softly. "You were too hurt." But both of them knew there was no such choice. Not working meant punishment, and punishment meant even more pain or something worse. Helena forced herself to walk outside, preparing for another day of suffering. Daniel was already at the sawmill when the sun fully rose over the horizon. He had arrived before the other workers. which was unusual. Normally, he worked at his own pace, coming when it was necessary. But today, things were different. He was preparing, arranging tools, examining the area, placing things in very specific positions. To anyone watching, it simply looked like a hard-working man organizing his space. But Daniel had a plan. The Drummond twins woke up late as usual. They enjoyed a slow breakfast of eggs, fresh bread, strong coffee and fruit. Donna Amelia casually asked about their plans for the day, and Bernardo answered with a pleasant smile. "We're going to inspect the sawmill. Check if the work is being done properly." Balthazar smiled as well, and Donna Amelia pretended not to understand the dark meaning behind those smiles. She had become very skilled at ignoring certain things over the years. It was nearly 10 o'clock in the morning when the twins finally left the main house. They walked slowly across the property, watching people work, whispering cruel remarks to each other, enjoying the feeling of total power. When they reached the sawmill, they saw Daniel working alone. The other men who usually worked there had been sent to repair a broken fence, a very convenient coincidence that the twins did not question. Daniel did not hear them enter, of course, but he felt the vibration of their boots against the den floor. He slowly turned around, facing the two men who had hurt his mother the day before. For the first time, the twins truly looked at Daniel, not as property or a tool, but as a real physical presence. And what they saw made them pause for a brief moment. Daniel measured 7 feet 2 inches tall. But it was not only his height, it was the width of his shoulders, the thickness of his arms, the hands as large as plates. It was the way he filled the entire space, how his presence seemed to make everything around him feel smaller. And it was his eyes, dark and intense, fixed on the twins with a quality they could not explain, but that made something deep in their stomachs tighten. Bernardo was the first to regain his confidence. "So you are Daniel, the deaf giant everyone talks about." Daniel read his lips perfectly. He did not reply. "He can't hear you, fool," Balthazar said, pushing his brother playfully. "You have to speak louder." They laughed at the cruel and pointless joke. Daniel remained completely still, simply watching them. "Your mother fell yesterday," Bernardo continued, stepping closer. "She was very clumsy. I hope she learned to be more careful." Daniel read every word. His fists slowly tightened at his sides. Balthazar noticed it. "Look," he understood. Smarter than he seems, this one. But is he smart enough to remember his place? Bernardo was now only a meter away, because it seems everyone on this estate is forgetting that we command, and you obey. He stretched out his hand and pressed his index finger against Daniel's chest. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless physically, but filled with meaning. It was a challenge, a sign of disrespect, a claim of dominance. Daniel looked down at the finger touching his chest, then lifted his eyes back to Bernardo's face. He did not move. "See," Bernardo said to his broth, wry with a grin. "Gentle as a lamb, all that size, and good for nothing except cutting wood." That was when they made their fatal mistake. Balthazar stepped closer from the other side, and the two began circling Daniel, studying him like a strange animal. They commented about his size, his deafness, his usefulness, speaking as if he were not even there, or as if he could not understand. But Daniel understood perfectly. He saw every word forming on their lips, every look of contempt, every cruel smile, and something inside him, the last restraint, the final thread of patience, finally snapped. It happened so quickly the twins barely understood what was happening. Daniel moved with shocking speed for someone so large. His right hand grabbed Bernardo's throat before he could react, lifting him off the ground, as if he weighed nothing. His left hand caught Balthazar by the collar when he tried to step away, pulling him back with a force that nearly knocked him down. For a moment, the three remained frozen in that position, Daniel holding the two men who had tortured his mother. The twins experiencing true fear for the first time in their comfortable lives. Daniel did not squeeze. He did not hurt them. He simply held them there, his eyes moving between the two pale faces, watching the terror growing inside them. He wanted them to feel a small part of what his mother had felt. He wanted them to understand what it meant to be completely helpless before someone stronger. Then slowly, he released them. Bernardo dropped to his knees, coughing violently, his hands clutching his throat. Balthazar stumbled backward, nearly falling, his eyes wide with shock and anger. You dared touch me," Bernardo shouted when he recovered his voice, but fear was breaking through his words. Daniel simply stared at them, his face calm and unreadable. He did not try to attack again. He had already done what he wanted. He had shown that his kindness was a choice, not weakness, that his size was not only for labor, that he could, if he wanted, be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Balthazar was the first to recognize the truth of the situation. "We need to leave here now." They slowly backed toward the door, keeping their eyes fixed on Daniel, expecting him to strike again. But Daniel simply stood there watching them leave, motionless like a mountain. When they stepped out of the sawmill into the sunlight, the twins almost ran back to the main house. Their elegant clothes were messy, their pride wounded, fear still racing through their veins. But fear in men used to total power quickly turns into vengeful anger. "I will have that animal hanged," Bernardo shouted when they reached the veranda, his face red with humiliation. "I will personally put the rope around his neck." "Calm down," Balthazar said, thinking more carefully, despite his own fear. "If we kill him like that, so openly, it will raise questions. Father does not like losing valuable property without reason." "He attacked me," Bernardo said, touching his throat, where red marks were starting to appear. "He held you," Balthazar corrected. "He did not squeeze. He did not truly hurt you. Technically, he could say he was defending himself if we claimed we attacked him first. And everyone on the estate knows we went there to provoke him." Bernardo hated when his brother was right. "So what do you suggest?" Balthazar thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing as a plan slowly formed. "His mother. Helena. We will take her. We can do whatever we want with her. Father will not question punishment for a troublesome slave, and Daniel will have to watch." Bernardo's smile slowly returned. "We will make him feel it, but he will not be able to do anything if he does not want to make tea." Ing's worse. It was pure, calculated cruelty. "You were truly diabolical, brother." "I am practical," Balthazar replied calmly. "Revenge is better when the victim actually suffers. Killing Daniel would be too fast. Making him watch his mother be destroyed, that is real suffering." They sent for the overseer, a brutal man named Sebastio, who carried out punishments without asking questions. Orders were given to bring Helena to the central courtyard, where everyone could see. The news spread through the estate like fire through dry grass. People stopped working, fear spreading across the community. Everyone knew what it meant when someone was taken to the central courtyard. It meant public punishment, meant to be an example. Rosa ran toward the sawmill, her old legs struggling with the speed. She found Daniel still standing in the same place where he had confronted the twins, staring at his own hands as if they no longer belonged to him. She stood directly in front of him, waving her arms wildly, until she caught his attention. When Daniel focused on her, Rosa exaggerated the words on her lips. "Helena, courtyard. Now, punishment." The blood drained from Daniel's face. He understood instantly there would be consequences for what he had done, and those consequences would fall on his mother. He ran. Daniel crossed the estate with enormous strides, people moving aside when they saw him coming. He reached the central courtyard at the exact moment. Sebastio was tying Helena to the punishment post. She was already crying, not from pain yet, but from fear of what she knew was about to happen. When she saw Daniel running toward her, her eyes widened in horror, not for herself, but for him. She shook her head violently, begging him silently to stop, to stay away, not to make things worse. But Daniel did not stop. The twins were standing on the veranda watching. When they saw Daniel approaching, Balthazar smiled. "Look at that. He came to watch." Daniel reached the edge of the courtyard and stopped. His fists were clenched, his entire body shaking with contained fury. But he did not step into the circle, did not move any closer. He knew that any action from him would only make his mother's suffering worse. Sebastian raised the whip, waiting for the twins' signal. 20 lashes, Bernardo ordered, his eyes fixed on Daniel. And I want them hard. The first strike landed, and Helena screamed. The sound tore through the silent air, and people flinched in sympathy. Daniel took an involuntary step forward, but forced himself to stop. The second blow came, then the third. Each one pulling another scream from Helena. Each one tearing more skin from her back. Each one dropping blood onto the dirt ground. Daniel watched every second. He did not look away. He did not close his eyes. He forced himself to witness everything that his action had caused. Tears flowed down his face, but he remained standing, his complete helplessness pressing against him like a heavy physical weight. After 10 lashes, Helena stopped screaming. She just remained there, trembling weakly, her body barely able to endure any more pain. She moaned faintly, her body jerking with every harsh strike. Daniel could not endure it any longer. He started walking toward the circle, ready to stop everything, no matter what it might cost him. But then Helena lifted her head, finding his eyes through the blur of tears and pain. Slowly, she shook her head, a firm and clear refusal. She was telling him without words, "No, do not sacrifice yourself for me. Do not ruin your future for these few terrible minutes. Do not allow them to kill you, because I could not live, knowing my death destroyed your life." Daniel froze where he stood, torn apart between every instinct inside him and the silent request from his mother. The strikes continued. 15, 18, 20. When it finally ended, Helena hung from the ropes that held her up, unconscious, or almost so. Sebastian untied her, and she fell heavily to the ground. Her body looked like a map of bleeding wounds and torn skin. Now, Balthazar said loudly so everyone could hear, "This is what happens to those who forget their place, and to the families of those who forget their place." Daniel was on his knees, staring at his broken mother, feeling something inside him collapse. Rosa and several other women rushed forward to help Helena, lifting her gently and carrying her away from the courtyard. As they passed Daniel, Rosa stopped for a brief second. She looked directly at him, and her eyes carried a simple but powerful message. "This is their fault, not yours. Never forget that." Daniel stayed kneeling there long after everyone had gone. The sun burned down without mercy, dust slowly settling back to the ground, and the world moved on as if nothing terrible had taken place. But something deep inside had shifted completely. The anger Daniel once felt had been hot and reckless. What he felt now was different. This anger was cold, patient, and unstoppable. He had tried to be gentle. He had tried to be only strong enough to defend himself, and his mother had paid the price for that restraint. He would not live halfway anymore. Either he would accept total submission, or he would accept total rebellion. And submission no longer existed in his heart. Night slowly covered the Belmont estate, thick with tension. Helena was cared for by the women inside one of the slave cabins. Her back was treated with the few herbs they could find, and her wounds were washed with water that burned almost as much as the whip had. She drifted in and out of awareness, feverish and weak from the blood she had lost. Daniel remained beside her the entire night, holding her hand, his massive body filling nearly the entire small room. The women who tended Helena worked around him quietly, never asking him to move. No one had the courage to ask, and everyone understood the silent watch he was keeping. In the early hours before dawn, Helena finally woke fully. Her eyes found Daniel, and fresh tears slid down her face. He gently touched her cheek, careful not to cause pain. Slowly he shaped words with his lips so she could read them. "I am sorry. My fault." Helena shook her head with all the strength she had left. She answered with weak but determined gestures. "No, theirs, always theirs." It was a moment of pure understanding between mother and son. a realization that evil did not live in the victims who tried to defend themselves, but in the systems that made defense necessary. The guilt did not belong to the oppressed who finally said no. It belonged to the oppressors who created a world where saying no meant death. Daniel nodded slowly as something hardened inside his chest. Not just anger, but purpose. A dark and powerful purpose that came from finally understanding what Rosa had tried to show him. This was not his fault. The blame belonged only to those who held the whips, not to those who finally refused to bow. Helena's breathing slowly became calmer as the herbs began their quiet work, pulling her toward healing sleep. Before she closed her eyes again, she reached up and touched Daniel's face one more time. In her gaze he saw something unexpected. Not fear of what he might do next, but trust. Trust that whatever choice he made would come from love, not cruelty. That he would never become what they were, no matter what actions he might take. When she finally drifted into deep sleep, Daniel carefully slipped his hand from hers and stood up. The other women in the room watched him silently, their eyes wide. They had all heard what he had done at the sawmill, and with every retelling the story had grown larger. Rosa stepped toward him, her weathered face serious. She moved her hands carefully, making sure he understood every sign. "What will you do now?" Daniel looked at her quietly for a long moment. Then his hands moved slowly in the sign language they had created together over the years. "Justice." Rosa nodded slowly. She did not ask what that meant. In her 60 years of life, she had learned that justice could wear many different faces, and in a world as broken as theirs, sometimes the face of justice looked a lot like vengeance, and that was acceptable. "Be careful," she signed back. "The world is not ready for what you might become." Daniel's answer was simple. The world should have thought about that before. He left the slave cabins just as the first faint light of dawn touched the eastern sky. The estate was still mostly asleep. The exhausted enslaved people were catching the little rest they could before another cruel day began. The white residents slept peacefully in their confidence of their own superiority, protected by laws, guns, and the confidence of their own superiority. Daniel moved through the darkness like a ghost, despite his huge size. Years of navigating the world through feeling and vibration had taught him how to move quietly, how to sense obstacles before reaching them, and how to disappear when necessary. He went first to the sawmill. The tools he needed were there, not weapons in the usual sense, but in his hands, almost anything could become a weapon. He carefully chose a heavy wooden mallet, a coil of rope, and several long iron nails normally used in construction. He also took a thick canvas tarp, folding it tightly and securing it across his broad back. Then he began the long walk toward the main house. It stood on the hill like a monument built from stolen labor. Its white walls glowed softly in the pale light before sunrise. 2 stories of elegant design, all built by enslaved hands, for people who would never admit the labor that created their comfort. Daniel had only been inside the house twice in his life. Once when he was a small child while his mother worked there before she was sent back to the fields, and once 3 years earlier when he had been called to repair a broken ceiling beam. He remembered the layout perfectly. His mind stored spaces the way other people remembered faces. The Drummond twins slept in neighboring rooms on the 2nd floor, on the eastern side of the house. Their windows faced the rising sun, and both young men were known for sleeping late, their bodies soft from lives without real work. Daniel watched the house from the tree line, calculating. The household staff would wake soon. The cook would start preparing breakfast. The maids would begin cleaning. But for a short window, perhaps 30 minutes, the house would be at its most vulnerable. He moved closer, his bare feet silent on the grass. The front door would certainly be locked, but he knew from his earlier visit that the door leading to the root cellar was often left unsecured. It was a lazy mistake made by people who never imagined anyone would dare to enter their home uninvited. The cellar door opened with only the faintest whisper. Daniel stepped down into darkness that meant nothing to him. He had lived in a different kind of darkness his entire life, and physical darkness almost felt comforting. He moved by touch and memory, finding the stairs that led up into the house. The door at the top opened into a narrow hallway near the kitchen. Daniel paused, feeling the vibrations through the wooden floor. No movement yet. The house still slept. He climbed the servants' staircase toward the second floor, placing each step with careful precision. The wood was old, as likely to creak, but Daniel's sensitivity to vibration helped him find the silent spots where the boards stayed firm. The hallway stretched ahead of him, lined with doors. He counted them silently. The master bedroom at the far end where Donna Amelia slept, 2 guest rooms in the middle, and then the twins' rooms at the eastern end. Bernardo's room came first. Daniel stood outside the door, with his hand on the handle, allowing himself one brief moment of doubt. What he was about to do would change everything. It would almost certainly end his life. They would hunt him, capture him, and kill him in the most brutal way imaginable, to warn others. But then he thought of his mother's torn back, of the screams they had forced from her, of the casual cruelty in their eyes while they ordered her punishment. And he knew this would happen again and again, to her, to others, to everyone, because men like the Drummond twins never stopped until someone stopped them. He opened the door. Bernardo slept in a large bed covered with expensive linens, his face calm in the pale gray light of dawn. In sleep he looked younger, almost harmless, and for a brief second Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Then he remembered that this innocent-looking face had smiled while ordering 20 lashes. Daniel crossed the room in 3 silent steps. One massive hand covered Bernardo's mouth and nose, cutting off both air and sound at the same time. Bernardo's eyes flew open wide with terror and confusion, staring at the huge shadow standing over him. Daniel leaned close so Bernardo could clearly see his face, and read the words forming on his lips. "For my mother." Bernardo struggled wildly, trying to scream, trying to fight back, but it was like a child fighting a mountain. Daniel's other hand pressed firmly against his chest, pinning him to the mattress with unstoppable strength. He did not crush his throat. Daniel wanted him awake for what would follow. With practiced skill from years of working with rope, Daniel quickly tied Bernardo's hands and feet, then gagged him using a strip torn from the fine linen sheet. The young man's eyes were huge, tears streaming down his face as his body shook with raw terror. Daniel left him there and moved silently to Balthazar's room. The second twin was also sleeping, though he stirred slightly as Daniel entered, some deep instinct warning him of danger. His eyes opened just as Daniel's hand clamped over his face. The same panic, the same helpless struggle, the same quick and efficient binding. Once both twins were secured, Daniel carried them one at a time down the servant stairs. To him, they weighed almost nothing despite their desperate movements. He carried them down into the cellar, placing them next to each other on the cold dirt ground. After that, he went back upstairs and picked up the canvas tarp from where he had left it. He also grabbed 2 pillows from Bernardo's bed. When he returned to the cellar, Daniel sat quietly on a wooden crate and stared at his prisoners in the darkness his eyes could not truly see, yet his other senses understood perfectly. He could feel their fear spreading through the room, like heat rising from a fire. Their bodies trembled, and he sensed it clearly. Slowly he reached forward and removed Bernardo's gag. "Please," Bernardo gasped right away, his voice cracked and desperate. "Please, we're sorry. We didn't mean it. We swear." Daniel calmly placed the gag back into his mouth. He had no need to listen to lies. Next, he removed Balthazar's gag. "My father will pay anything," Balthazar said quickly, his voice shaking though he tried to sound reasonable even now. "Any price you want. Freedom, money, land, whatever you ask. We can arrange it." Daniel pushed the gag back into his mouth as well. More lies. More lies. More attempts to control the situation, trying to find some advantage, trying to use the power that had always protected them. At last he removed both gags, one final time. In the quiet darkness before dawn inside the cellar, he did something he had not done since he was a small boy. He made a sound. It was not exactly words. His deaf voice could not shape proper speech. He had never learned the careful movements of spoken language, but he could still produce sound, rough and powerful and frightening. A long, deep, sorrowful sound rose from him. Part groan, part howl, part question, thrown into an unfair world. Both twins froze instantly, shocked into silence by the strange voice of the giant they had always mocked as broken. Then Daniel stood up, towering above them in the dark, and made his choice. He did not kill them, even after everything, even with the anger burning inside him, even with the justice that could easily have justified it, even with the cold logic that said they deserved death. He still did not kill them. Instead, he spread the canvas tarp over them like a tent, trapping them inside darkness. He placed the pillows from Bernardo's bed inside with them, not as comfort, but so that when panic finally forced screams out of them, the sound would be softened and hidden. Then he stacked heavy sacks of grain and flour around and partly on top of the tarp, building a tight prison that would not be easily discovered. They would be found eventually. The household would wake soon, notice they were gone, and begin searching. It might take several hours. It might take an entire day. But they would be found alive, terrified, humiliated, but still alive. And in that moment of mercy, or perhaps it was the most painful punishment possible, Daniel showed them that he was more human than they had ever been. Even with every reason to commit murder, he chose something different. Their cruelty could not turn him cruel. It could only make him just. Before leaving, he removed the gags once more. He leaned close to each face, so they could see his lips clearly in the faint light filtering down from above. And he spoke 2 simple words they would remember for the rest of their lives. Remember this. Then he left, moving quietly back through the house, climbing up from the cellar, stepping out into the early morning air as the first sunlight appeared on the horizon. He walked across the estate and returned to the slave quarters. Inside, he found his mother awake. Rosa was helping her sit up carefully, despite the pain in her back. When Helena saw Daniel enter, her eyes searched his face carefully. She looked for blood. She looked for guilt. She looked for the heavy burden that would come from becoming a killer. Instead, she saw something different. Peace, resolution, the calm face of a man who had faced hell itself and walked back out without losing who he was. Daniel knelt beside her and gently took her hand. With his other hand, he formed signs in their private language. They're alive. They'll be found. But they will never forget. Helena's eyes filled with tears, not tears of sadness, but tears that carried pride mixed with relief. Her son had stood up. He had acted. And somehow he had protected his own humanity while doing it. What now? She signed quietly. Daniel answered with simple movements of his hand. Now we see what happens to monsters who finally learn fear. The twins were discovered 6 hours later, weak from thirst and shaking with trauma. Their expensive clothes soaked with sweat and urine. They could not explain what had happened. They could not admit that someone they had called defective had defeated them so completely and so easily. When their father returned 2 days later, in furious anger, they told him they had been attacked by several men. They claimed it must have been an organized revolt and that they were lucky to escape with their lives. Colonel Drummond ordered investigations. He ordered interrogations and punishments, but no one knew anything because there was nothing to know. Daniel had left behind no evidence, no witnesses, no trail. And strangely, after that night the twins never harmed another enslaved person again. They never went near the sawmill. They never spoke Daniel's name. They moved through the plantation like shadows, changed men, their cruel arrogance destroyed by one single night of helpless terror. The other enslaved people noticed the change. Though they never spoke openly about it, they understood that something had shifted. Some invisible boundary had been crossed, and in the way Daniel walked now, still gentle, still calm, still kind, but carrying a new quiet strength that made even armed overseers step aside without thinking. They saw the truth. Dignity could not be taken. It could only be surrendered. And sometimes in a world built on violence, The greatest rebellion was not killing your oppressors. Sometimes the greatest rebellion was showing them mercy they did not deserve and could never repay. Helena's back slowly healed over many months, though scars remained that would stay with her for the rest of her life. But something deeper healed as well. Some wound beyond the body, something that had almost broken their spirits. Mother and son survived. The cruel system around them still existed. It would continue for years, until larger forces far beyond any single person would finally destroy it. But in that moment when Daniel chose justice instead of revenge, mercy instead of murder, humanity instead of hatred, they had already won the only victory that truly mattered. They had remained themselves, and in the dark cellar of the Belmont estate before sunrise, two young men who believed they were untouchable learned a lesson they would carry forever. True power does not come from cruelty, ownership, or law. True power comes from knowing who you are when the entire world tries to convince you that you are nothing. And a deaf man who stood 7 feet 2 inches tall, born into chains, carried more strength inside his kindness than they would ever hold in all their violence. The sun rose on August 5th, 1858, and in some small yet irreversible way, the world had changed.